This is Prototype. Oh no, hang on a second. That was actually Infamous. This is Prototype. It's a super power-focused action-adventure game with a unique movement system, which originally came out in 2009. And are we sure we're not still talking about Infamous? No, this is definitely a different game. But then that begs the question, what the hell happened to Prototype? Where did it go? And is it ever coming back? Today we're gonna do our best to answer those questions and take a look at a short-lived game series that deserves more credit than it gets. But first, make sure to subscribe to Nerdstalgic Gaming if you're into videos like this one. Developed by Radical Entertainment and published by Activision, the first Prototype game follows a Venom-like protagonist named Alex Mercer as he maneuvers his way through New York City in the edgiest way possible. That early 2000s grit really permeated the entire game, and it is glorious. It's also pretty funny to step back and look at how Activision basically just made the unlicensed Venom game we didn't know we needed. At a time when Venom wasn't really represented that well in gaming, and depending on your feelings about Spider-Man 2, he still isn't, but that's besides the point. Before developing Prototype, Radical Entertainment was mostly known for The Simpsons Hit and Run, Road Rage, and the early 2000s era of the Crash Bandicoot series.
Top of the morning and the cock-a-doodle-doo sports fan.
To say Prototype was a departure from those earlier titles feels a little tame. Designed by Eric Holmes of Earthworm Jim 3D fame and directed by Lindsay Williamson Christie, the M-rated action-adventure main appeal was violence. Slicing, crushing, and just generally murderizing your way through hordes of enemies and helpless innocents. It was a pure, super-powered fantasy through and through, just like that other game that came out only a month before it. But let's be fair here. Though the premises, release dates, and visuals are remarkably similar, Prototype is not a one-for-one copy of Infamous. Realistically, Prototype is actually just a spiritual successor to Radical's cult hit Incredible Hulk Ultimate Destruction. But since Prototype and Infamous are so weirdly similar on the surface, it only seems fair to compare them. While the powers in Infamous are caused by a naturally occurring genetic mutation, Prototype's superpowers are the product of a human-made virus. Both games have upgradable powers, but Prototype's are heavily focused on Alex Mercer's shape-shifting ability. Prototype's powers are also way more visceral, considering Infamous was shooting for that T for teen rating and had to tamp down on the gore. While both games have great movement systems, Prototypes is arguably more dynamic. It's similar in style to something like the early Spider-Man games, just with less web swinging and more ground pounding. And where Infamous is pretty straightforward superhero origin story, Prototype deals with amnesia, a zombie outbreak, and a whole lot of military propaganda. I mean, military action. Right, Activision? Right? Actually, to give Prototype its due, the military are the principal antagonists of the game and spend most of the story trying to kill Alex and cover up their involvement in the creation of the zombie virus. While not particularly fresh, it's still an interesting idea, especially for an Activision game made in 2009, but they still make you slog through tank and helicopter missions, so, it's a trade-off. Unlike Infamous, there's no morality system in Prototype, but they do manage to tell a pretty morally gray tale. The story was written by game writer Dennis Detwiller and comic book writer Paul Jenkins, and you can definitely feel those comic influences throughout. It's about as close to a supervillain story as you can get, with Alex absorbing civilians and casually destroying the city on a straight-up revenge quest. And yet, that revenge quest feels justified when you consider all he's been through. To put it simply, Prototype stood on its own. It was a solid game, a really solid game. Even though critics called out the flat and uninteresting graphics, clunky targeting system, and dreadfully dull no powers mission, the game still boasted pretty high reviews, especially for a game dev team that had never made anything like it before. But more importantly, at least for Activision executives, the game sold well. Though game sales were down across the industry, Prototype topped sales charts the month it was released, and it had sold 2 million units by the time the sequel was ready to launch. Oh yeah, there's a sequel. Prototype 2 came out in April of 2012, 1 year after Infamous 2, but who's counting? Just like the first game, it was developed by Radical Entertainment and published by Activision. But this time, the creative heads would be switched around a little, or rather a lot. Virtually none of the original game's creators are credited on Prototype 2, and that's because a lot of them weren't even working for Activision during most of the sequel's development. More than likely, they were laid off around 2010, when over 200 Activision employees were let go. That included 90 employees from Radical Entertainment alone, so yeah, that sucks. I guess that explains why the team was so different. But despite what was probably a much lower morale around the office, Radical Entertainment persisted and created a worthy sequel to the first prototype game. In Prototype 2, players take control of James Heller, a former sergeant of the US Marines who had sworn vengeance on Alex Mercer for the deaths of his wife and daughter. During a confrontation, Heller is infected with the virus and so gains the same powers as Mercer. It's another revenge story, but this time Radical has positioned the previous protagonist as the main villain. It's generally accepted among fans of the franchise that Prototype 2 has the weaker story and main character, but this premise is at least a fun idea, even if it wasn't executed as well as it could have been. Otherwise, Prototype 2 is everything you could want out of a sequel. The 3 years between releases means the game looks significantly better than its predecessor. The character models are more realistic, the city is more detailed, and the effects are stunning. Not only that, but the gameplay feels smoother, targeting enemies is a lot less of a hassle, and the superpowers are just as fun as they always were. The environment is a lot more destructible in the sequel, and while the missions themselves felt a little too standard and sometimes way too easy, it was an undeniably fun romp. And critics and players agree. The game got a similar score to the first from most gaming publications, and while overall game sales were still down, Prototype 2 was the top seller the month it came out, just as the first game had been 3 years prior. But that wasn't enough for Activision. Citing poor sales numbers, Activision would shut down Radical Entertainment less than a month after Prototype 2's release. I guess being a two-time top seller during a slow period doesn't get you much in the gaming industry. The employees who didn't leave Radical Entertainment before its shutdown were shuffled onto other projects, and the Prototype IP was never spoken of again. This was, and still is, a really depressing fact for fans of the franchise, especially when the infamous series would get a third installment in 2014 on next-gen hardware with DLC, but we're totally not bitter about it. As far as we know, Activision has no plans on returning to the franchise, and I mean, sure, aspects of Prototype do feel like they are part of a bygone era of gaming, one where players were mostly content to run around a city sandbox and wreck randoms on the street. In all seriousness, the Prototype series hasn't had a chance to reach its fullest potential. The developers who poured their hearts into both games were pretty ruthlessly cast aside or forcibly absorbed by Activision, and their creations were left to fade away into obscurity. Prototype was raw and fun and maybe a little cringe in places, and it was great. Calls for a third game are still popping up all these years later, and that has to say something for the dedication of the fan base, if nothing else. One fan even tried to rally around a change.org petition in a bid to get that elusive third game. Prototype has become an example of game publishers who are so afraid of taking creative risk that they'd rather put hundreds of people out of a job than risk an executive's end-of-year bonus. It has become a reminder that fans have to speak up and keep persisting if they really want to see a game made. For fans like the one who started the change.org petition, it's become a symbol of what could have been, and what could still be, and maybe it's a symbol of how badly we need a standalone Venom game. So, at the risk of sounding like an early 2000s edgy video game protagonist, we'll paraphrase Alex Mercer. What has Prototype become? Something less than a thriving franchise, but also something more. Thanks so much for watching this video all the way to the end. If you liked it, let us know by clicking the thumbs up button, subscribing to the channel, and sounding off in the comments. And hey, consider checking out our deep dive into the infamous series, and we'll see you next time.